Ooh, it's that boogeyman inflation, which really isn't a boogeyman. It, like anything else, can be used towards whatever your goals are, or even increase your net worth, your business, or your savings, or particularly your outlays. There are three types. Let's get the basics down of inflation because we're going to build upon this, especially with all the talk, with all the money that's coming out of the Fed, trillions of dollars from the Fed, from the surplus bills, from the Who Cares Act. All these different things are coming in. But what is inflation? Let's at least get back down to the basics of what that is. So inflation, what is it? Remember, this context is in macroeconomics only and not in finance and investing. This is very important. This comes up so often throughout learning about finance, economics, accounting. And when you're dealing with teachers, a lot of times they forget or assume, just because they're so familiar with the financial, the economic language, what context they're in, because they already know. But it's very important for beginners to understand context. I've talked about this in some of my other videos, because the context can change with what the meaning is of whatever the term is. We have interest rates. If we're talking about interest rates from an economic point of view, it can be very different from a financial or an investing point of view. Same thing when you're talking about credit from an economic point of view, and the inflows of, or the outflows and ability to qualify for loans, as opposed to credit within accounting. It's very different. It's very important. Always keep this in mind when you're talking about those three: the finance, the economics, and the accounting. When I'm hearing these terms, think, what context am I in? I've got very confused on these items going through with getting an MBA in finance, and I got burned a few times, and I realized this lesson early on that I better solidify what that context is. And a lot of times, or actually most of the time, I had to do it myself because of the reason that I told you, that finance people it's just their lingo. It's natural for them to talk that way and assume the context. Anyway, let's get into a definition of inflation. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising while affecting negatively the purchasing power of currency. Now, one thing to note here, what's not included in the definition is necessarily an increased amount of spending. That is one of the three types of inflation, and we're going to talk about that. It's called demand pull inflation. And we're going to talk about that. But in this definition, take note that that phrase is not in the true, simplified, foundational definition of inflation. So I want you to keep that in mind, that simply inflation is just what this is. It's the rate over, which means over time, over a time period, the prices of goods are going up, and as they're going up, the purchasing power of your money is not staying at the same pace. So the point here is that it says in the note, the definition does not necessarily mean because of increased spending, which is also, there's a fancy term called velocity, and velocity just means how quickly the money is being spent, the rate at which money is being spent within the economy. And as it increases, it heats up the economy, and as they call it, it heats up, which is usually an indication for inflation. But I want you to be able to say that if someone's talking about inflation, what does this necessarily, which one of the three types is there? Are we talking about, or is the actual case for where we're at? Because it does not have an inference. You should not take an inference, just take it for what it is. Okay, let's move on to the three different types. Okay, so inflation, we've got three types. Demand pull inflation is the first one. It's the most common theory in effect. This is usually thought of as the one that's inherent in the actual definition of inflation, but which I had mentioned before to ward that off, because there are three different types of inflation. And we'll find out a little bit more when we get into the third type of inflation, which will just reinforce that point where you have the definition of inflation and don't automatically assume that it is because of more chasing, fewer dollars chasing more goods. So aggregate demand is outpacing aggregate supply. So we just have the overall demand for goods and services at a national level is just outpacing the aggregate supply. So we have more dollars chasing fewer products and services, and if more people are going after the same thing, one thing we know is the most basic tenets of demand and supply is that the prices are going to increase. Very often this type of inflation is talked about with a combination of lowering unemployment or low unemployment and rising GDP. Now, we've had a couple of years here prior in 2019 and 2018. We've had very low unemployment and a rising, albeit somewhat slower, GDP, and the inflation rate over the last couple of years hasn't been anything astronomical. In fact, where we're at right now, the Fed is trying to find ways to create more inflation, which is for a different topic for a different video, because of all the QE influx of the currency that's been overflowing here the last 6 months since March, since we've gotten into this pandemic. But what's a good example of this? Now, this is kind of bringing it down at the housing market level instead of the whole national level. But if you go back to the mid-2000s, the unbelievable demand for housing, residential housing. Of course, there was all the subprime lending that went on where people were not, subprime lenders were not only getting approved for one mortgage, many of them were getting approved for two or three. And, well, bottom line is you had way too many excitement, way too much aggregate demand in the residential housing market for the amount of houses that were actually being able to being supplied that were on the market. And hence we had that unbelievable crazy boom, 2006, 2007. Things just went absolutely astronomical. But that's just a good example of a demand pull type of inflation. Now that's not the full national inflation, that's at the housing market level, but it's something that most of us are aware of and live through, and it really drives the point home. Let's move on. Cost push inflation. So here we don't have an increased aggregate demand, but we have substantial increases in the cost of the imported goods or services where there's no suitable alternative. So this is where nowhere else to go, and you need to buy. Usually these are products that are affected, that are ones that are need to buy products, not want to buy, right? So we're not talking about luxury products here. And what happens is the demand is not going up, and even the supply isn't necessarily going down. It's just that the price of production is substantially increased for whatever reason. And obviously those prices need to be passed on. And if they are in a sector like our example here, when it comes to oil, well, oil affects everything, right? Oil affects not just your gas and everything going to work, but all the goods and services that come in from the ports from the east and west coast. Everything needs to be brought and traveled from those ports to distribution centers, to substation distribution centers, and then eventually to actual markets. And all those prices of the gas needs to get passed on. So the perfect example of this was the OPEC oil crisis, where OPEC there's a long political battle that went on during the 70s with that, and OPEC increased the cost of production in a pretty substantial, astronomical amount for relative to those times. Now, people didn't need more gasoline, but the gasoline prices went through the roof. So much so that the president at the time tried to ward this off, and these things usually don't work, but to limit the amount of gas that anyone could buy, to having there were what was called alternative days. There was alternative days when you could buy your gas. You could buy your, if your license plate ended on an even number, you could only buy gas on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and so forth. But think about this: the demand didn't change, but the cost of it, the good and service, in this case it was gas, went much higher, and those prices went up, and that was inflation. We had inflation, and as that decade went on, the inflation really increased. Okay, our third type is built-in inflation. I'm being a little bit smart here. I call it a bit of the cop-out definition, but this kind of gets into the whole part. When we talk about economics, we have plenty of examples that support different theories or different definitions, and if one really wanted to find examples where those weren't really the case, you can find them too. That used to bug me about economics. I now find it interesting because it's really a discussion point that it isn't an exact science. And to that's in essence what the built-in inflation is. The simplest, there isn't really a definition, but it's more of a feeling that inflation is here because, well, we've already have inflation probably from some type of mix from the other two above. And so just because we've had inflation, there's also embedded in this a bit of a psychological, if we have inflation and we've already had it for quite a while, well, we're going to continue to have it. So this is the one that isn't, I don't want to say it's baseless, but it doesn't have the same foundation as the other two above. The other two above, we can provide some real examples, as I did here, that are very concrete. And the built-in inflation is sometimes, well, we just have inflation because we're having it. And a lot of times we'll have governments try and get involved here and try and change these inflation rates, and with the money supply, with fiscal supply, and very often you'll see that they don't really have much of an effect, even the 3 or 4 years later, which is how economics usually, how long it takes to have some type of effect. I wanted to bring up one point here with cost push inflation. Now, during here, this is at the time of this is October. We've been in this pandemic for about 7 months. There is a perceived inflation because CPI might be going up, because we all know that our costs of goods, when we, at least as insofar as when we go and get groceries, have definitely increased. I mean, they've been increasing for years, but they've increased quite a bit over the last 6 months. Now, a lot of people have actually cut back on amount of going out, on the amount of food that they buy, on budgeting. But we've still seen these prices, and what I should have mentioned here before as a good example, in my opinion, other people have talked about this, is as the pandemic's been pushed throughout the whole world, the supply chains have definitely been hugely affected. And as they've been hugely affected, although it has kind of the same effect as the increased production costs, but it's limited the supply. So in essence, we are falling, in my opinion, with our grocery prices within a cost push inflation, insofar as the prices of goods in your grocery store. And that's because the supply chains have been seriously hit, from the food production to the manufacturing and the distribution of all those And so we have the same amount, I would argue, the same amount, if not even a little bit less of a demand, but a definite decrease in the amount of supply of those products. And so that has caused price inflation. So I've given some of these smaller examples here, some limited in scope, but they provide the perfect understanding, which was my point of those, in terms of the inflation as a whole, if we're talking about a major national economy. All right, so what are our key takeaways? Well, there's three different types, and there's not just necessarily the high velocity one, which we all think of. That's just definitely not true. Right now we have increased prices, food prices, grocery prices, and to say that we have a higher demand and a lower aggregate supply of food currently 6-7 months into this pandemic, and that's the reason why our food prices are go up, but that just doesn't make any sense. Like I said in the prior clip, it's most likely from the push cost scenario. And now you wouldn't normally know that. Now, if you're thinking you only know the most common theory of inflation, that doesn't make sense. But if you understand that there's three types, at least you can now put some sense to it. And that's the point of this. Second thing is, inflation is not a bad thing at all. Let's get this out of your head right now. There's many financial benefits that occur for a nation and also occur at the individual investing level as inflation occurs over time. Most specifically, to try and drive this home, if you have a 30-year mortgage and you get yourself in at a decent rate like we have now, over time, the amount of the outlay of that mortgage as a percent of your income, it should be going down. One normally thinks that your income will go up over time. Yes, of course, there is the same inflation that's helping you that could hurt with the amount of money that you're earning. But if you're earning at a faster pace, that type of inflation actually helps you in terms of your monthly outlays, in terms of a percent and its effect on your standard of living. And of course, if there is inflation, your home value is more than likely to go up. And so inflation it's just another tool in this economic toolbox. Think of it that way. And then if you have yourself armed with the understanding of what it is and how we can respond to that, you can make money off of it. You can secure yourself. You can secure your financial situation. You can decrease your risk. You might still have risk, but you can decrease it. You can hedge it off. Stop thinking that this inflation thing is a bad thing, which they push on the media. They don't know what they're talking about. We're going to take this 3 steps back and realize that we can use anything to our benefit. Third thing, sometimes unexplained, but hey, that's economics. So that gets into the built-in inflation definition. This is one of the things that I used to be like, well, economics is such an arts thing, but there is a science to it. I think it all depends on what particular concept or term that you're talking about and where it is in time. And sometimes it might be a little bit more we don't know, because you'll see economists disagree on different parts of some major economic issues. And other times there's less disagreement. And that's why I gave you those other examples. But this is, sometimes there's just inflation and there isn't necessarily an exact reason for it. And that's just part of the economics and economic theory. So with that, I want to say hopefully you found this valuable and enjoyable in its own weird economic way. And I will have more videos every week. Until then, be seeing you.